Hey, what's up guys? Today, I'll show you a horror thriller film, Painless. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The film begins in 1930, Catalonia. In the first scenes, we see a young girl wandering through the forest. At one point, she reaches her friend and notices that her arm is burning. Nevertheless, she doesn't feel the pain. Convinced that everything will be fine, she gets oil poured on her head, and it catches fire as soon as she shakes her friend's hand. The little girl begins to feel tremendous pain and bursts out screaming. At the same time, a worried mother is searching for her little boy. She discovers her son in the basement, biting his hand without feeling any pain. She screams in despair as the child looks at her, confused. The first part of the story focuses on the special children who are brought to a doctor to be examined. He reveals that they have a neurological condition that does not allow these children to feel pain. People are horrified, and the authorities decide to keep the children out of society because they can be dangerous to themselves and others. The doctor feels there is no choice but to lock the children up. Subsequently, the kids are taken to an asylum. The nurses cover the children's mouths and put them in straitjackets to prevent self-harm. Ultimately, they are divided into cells. Sometime later, we meet a young boy named Benigno. It becomes clear that he is smart once he manages to break free from the straitjacket. Soon after, the nurse comes in to feed him and discovers that he has broken free, but she doesn't scold him. She smiles sweetly at him and begins to tear up. Benigno asks what tears are, and she tries to explain the meaning of emotions. The nurse is curious how much longer the children will be locked here, and the doctor says that since they have no other alternative, they will stay here until they find a cure. The nurse suggests calling a scientist to study the children and find a cure. The doctor doesn't have the courage to call a scientist, thinking that he's too busy to take care of the children. So the nurse decides to write a letter of invitation to a scientist on her own. Meanwhile, Benigno takes out a stolen spoon and digs a hole in the wall to get in touch with a girl locked up neighboring his cell. He finishes digging after 4 years, and the scientist arrives on one of those days. The nurse tells him that children never cry, and he is surprised. The scientist says he barely managed to get here from Germany because he has a Jewish passport. He wants to stay here as long as possible, so he asks for shelter. The scientist confirms that the children cannot be cured, but they can try to explain to them what pain is through lessons in medicine and anatomy. One day, the scientist brings some puppies. The children are excited to see and pet them. The scientist instructs them to find among them a puppy with a kidney tumor. He then asks who can remove the kidney without causing pain to the dog, as it has not been anesthetized. So Benigno steps forward to help and successfully removes the kidney, impressing the scientist. Benigno asks if he can have the puppy, but the doctor flatly refuses and orders him to return to his cell. The doctor is skeptical of the scientist's teaching methods, convinced that they are useless. Meanwhile, Benigno hides the puppy and takes it to his cell. At night, he calls his friend, the neighboring girl, and lets her pet the dog through the hole. At one point, the dog barks, and 2 nurses rush into Benigno's cell. One of them slaps him and grabs the dog. Enraged, Benigno cuts her leg. The doctor slaps Benigno, but the scientist stops him, telling him to behave rationally. On the other hand, the doctor declares that Benigno is out of the program and will no longer be allowed to leave cell number 17. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out, and communist soldiers infiltrate the building to store ammunition in the cells. They order all the children to be moved to a single cell, but the doctor insists on keeping the children separate. When the soldiers threaten them with weapons, the scientist steps in to explain that the children have a terrible, extremely contagious disease and should not be touched. The plan works, and the children remain isolated. However, the soldiers use the facility as a safe haven. Sometime later, the Nazis bomb and surround the building. Communist soldiers take off their uniforms and hide their weapons to blend in among the patients. When the Nazis arrive, they order everyone to show their shoulders. In this way, they discover those with bruises left by the guns and kill them. The scientist stops a mass shooting by telling the commander that he is a German scientist who is studying pain in sensitive children so that he can use this research to benefit the Reich. The commander believes him and lets the scientist, children, and nurses go. On the other hand, the doctor, who is also the director of this institute, gets killed for harboring communist soldiers. Ultimately, the remaining communist soldiers are cruelly shot. 3 years later in 1939, the war is still going on, and the lack of food and medicine prompts the scientists to inject the children with poison to kill them, ending their suffering. In the process, Benigno witnesses how the scientist kills the neighboring poor girl and gets enraged. When the scientist enters his cell, Benigno pretends to hug him, but then stabs him with something in the back. He then steps on the syringe and uses it to stab the scientist repeatedly. When the nurse notices him approaching her with bloody hands, she closes the door and gives the key to the military. When the armed forces enter Benigno's cell, they discover a skeleton on the wall in front of the window hole. They also come across Benigno, who has scars all over his body and has stopped talking. In addition, he has gone bald and has a tattoo of the rune Berkana, which means rebirth. Because of his ability to endure huge pain, the soldiers decide to take Benigno with them and turn him into a prolific torturer. The Nazis kidnap and bring enemy soldiers to Benigno's cell to interrogate and torture them to death. Later in 1963, a woman is brought to Benigno's cell for interrogation. When they bring her in, she starts humming a song and refuses to answer questions. Benigno is ordered to torture her, but when he sees her crying, he softens as she reminds him of the neighboring girl. He uses the pocket knife to free the woman and gives it to her, but she doesn't have the courage to kill him. Benigno is astonished and falls in love with her. In 1964, a soldier enters the cell with the intention of killing the woman. Benigno intervenes because the woman appears to be pregnant. At that point, the soldier promises to leave them alone if they give him the baby. A few months later, once the baby is born, he takes the infant and leaves the other two in the cell. Before leaving, the soldier orders that the entrance to the cell be bricked up so as to prevent Benigno from escaping. The second part of the story begins with Benigno's son, who Benigno conceived with the woman. He is named David and now has a wife who is 6 months pregnant. During a car trip, David falls asleep at the wheel and they are involved in a car accident. In the next scene, David wakes up in the hospital and gets out of bed confused. He goes out into the hallway, but collapses on the floor as he is still too weak. A neurosurgeon reveals to him that his wife did not survive the accident, but that the doctors were able to preserve the baby. David's problems don't end there. After an examination, he is diagnosed with lymphoma, and the neurosurgeon assures him that his only chance for survival is a bone marrow transplant from one of his parents. Initially, David is doubtful about the transplant because he has not spoken to his parents in a long time, and they are both elderly. However, the neurosurgeon convinces him to do it, emphasizing that he now has a child to take care of. After giving it some thought, David goes to his parents and reveals what happened to him. His parents are happy that his child has survived, but unfortunately, they state that they cannot help him with the transplant. David is impressed, but he cannot insist. The next day, his mother visits him in the hospital and says that they cannot help him because they are not his biological parents. It turns out she lost a child when she was younger, and it was a traumatic event. She then adds that she woke up one morning with baby David in her arms. It's revealed that her husband had brought David with him from prison, where he worked as a policeman, and they adopted him. The foster mother doesn't know much about his biological parents, but she does know that his biological mother was imprisoned in the 1960s. David goes to the abandoned asylum that was destroyed during the Spanish Civil War and World War II. He discovers a National Confederation of Veterans of Labor card with an address on it. David visits the head of the organization, who says that if his biological mother was in infamous cell number 17, she most likely did not survive. The man then reveals that he has a brother who was imprisoned there. He miraculously managed to escape from that cell and is still alive. Later, David returns to see his foster father and informs him of the former prisoner, whom he will visit the following day. The father refuses to talk about the past and tries to convince him that finding out the truth will only make him upset. He tells David that his biological mother is no longer alive and that he should forget the past. However, David becomes indignant with his father for preventing him from finding out the truth and leaves despite his foster mother's pleas to stay. David visits the former prisoner after a few days and asks about his biological mother, who was imprisoned in that building in the 1960s. The former prisoner responds by mentioning the name of Benigno, who tortured victims during interrogations. He describes Benigno as a vicious being who knows no pain. He reveals that he was also tortured repeatedly by Benigno to the point where his body became small enough to fit through a hole. David shows him a picture of his foster father when he was still a soldier, causing the man to scream in fright. After learning that his foster father knew Benigno, David phones him and tells him he will come to see him, demanding the truth at all costs. David arrives at his parents' house, but no one answers. He goes inside through a window and comes across a recording of a woman sobbing and singing. It's indeed his biological mother, as she was being interrogated by the Nazis. After listening to the recording, he goes upstairs and discovers his foster mother dead in the bathroom and his foster father sitting in a chair. He admits to loving David as if he were his own son, despite his having the terrible eyes of his real father, Benigno. He tells him that every time he looked into his eyes as a child, he had flashbacks of Benigno. Finally, he shoots himself in front of David without telling the whole truth. David is shocked, but he's too anxious to find out the truth to stop now. He returns to the asylum, certain that his biological parents still reside there. He soon locates cell number 17 and smashes the masonry. Inside, he finds a hole in the floor that leads to an underground room. He crawls up until he reaches a dark and frightening cavern. As he climbs the stairs, he hears the same tape he had listened to at his foster parents' house. He picks up the lit lighter next to the tape player and discovers that there is a deceased woman nearby, apparently his biological mother. As he looks around, a strange figure with scars all over his body approaches him and reveals himself to be indeed Benigno. He grabs David's shoulder from behind and stops to watch the tears as he prepares to kill him. Benigno stares at him for a few seconds and realizes that he has the same blue eyes as his biological mother. Shocked, David drops the lighter on the floor and the room begins to catch fire. Benigno doesn't kill him and then quietly walks into the flames. He picks up the woman's dead body, and the film ends with the biological father and son looking into each other's eyes. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.